Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Frustrated Book Purists. I am Miss Lauren. I did a video a couple of months ago on the Fellowship of the Ring, and now we're going to take a look at The Two Towers, which is the second part of the Lord of the Rings trilogy written by J.R.R. Tolkien, as well as the extended edition of Peter Jackson's The Two Towers and Ralph Baksh's The Lord of the Rings, which covers both Fellowship and half of Two Towers, so it's not the full experience, but I'll be taking a look at what he chose to cover in this movie. So, for a bit of personal history, The Two Towers, the Peter Jackson version, was my absolute favorite film in the trilogy growing up, and it's still my favorite. It is an excellent film. The Battle of Helm's Deep, oh my goodness, and the way they did Gollum, oh my goodness. But I want to take off my nostalgic glasses a little bit and really look at how both films adapted the story, what parts are really good, what parts were not so great, and so on and so forth. Just as a reminder, these opinions that I'm about to state are my own and not the official opinions of the Rehoboth Beach Public Library. And they are not meant to be objective. The point of Frustrated Book Purists is largely to start a discussion about what we feel worked and what didn't work. And we welcome any comments on what you liked or disliked about the movies and the books, respectively. So for starters, let's take a look at the story of The Two Towers. The Two Towers, or as a D&D enthusiast might call it, Don't Split the Party, opens with the Fellowship scattered in different directions. Boromir dies trying to stop the Uruk-hai from capturing Merry and Pippin. Gandalf had already fallen in the mines of Moria. The Uruk-hai are
taking the hobbits to Isengard,
while Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli chase after them to rescue their friends. Frodo and Sam escaped the chaos of the battle altogether and continued the journey to Mordor. The rest of the book follows three different plot lines. Merry and Pippin manage to escape from their captors and meet the tree shepherds known as Ents, who have to decide if they will get involved in the War of the Ring or not. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli fail to catch up with Merry and Pippin and meet a resurrected Gandalf instead, who guides them to the besieged kingdom of Rohan to help protect the people from Saruman's armies of Uruk-hai. Frodo and Sam encounter Gollum, who ends up guiding them towards Mordor, though whether he can be trusted is another matter entirely. Now, having read the book after seeing the movies, I can understand how this would be a difficult book to adapt. The Two Towers very much feels like the middle chapters of an ongoing story, and that's because that's really what it was initially. J.R.R. Tolkien conceived The Lord of the Rings as one gigantic story, and it was the publisher's decision to split it into three parts because of the length. So it's really just sort of, here's what's going on with the different characters at this point in the story. It's the same arc that started in the Fellowship of the Ring and is going to conclude in Return of the King. It starts out with a shocking moment with Boromir's death at the hands of the Uruk-hai, and it ends on a big cliffhanger with Frodo being captured in Mordor, but it has less of an individual arc compared to Fellowship and Return of the King. What's interesting about both the Jackson films and the Bakshi film is that when the live action films were first being put into development, it was thought by Peter Jackson's team that they would probably have to split it between two movies instead of doing three, that the studios wouldn't want to make that kind of investment. And New Line came along and said, yeah, no, there's three books, do three movies. Whereas Ralph Bakshi had to split it into two movies instead of three. And I think, unfortunately, the animated film is a good look at why splitting it in two wasn't such a great idea. Because The Two Towers does deal with a lot of new characters and new locations, and by splitting it into 3 movies, Jackson had more time to give them proper development and establish who they are. I talked about this more in the Fellowship of the Ring video, but basically the Ralph Bakshi film does an excellent job covering the events of Fellowship of the Ring, and then all of a sudden you've got Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli and Gandalf going to the Kingdom of Rohan in the 3rd act and meeting these new characters who we don't really know, and Frodo and Sam kind of going off on their journey with Gollum. Merry and Pippin, poor Treebeard gets 1 scene and that's it, and presumably it would have continued in part 2. So the ending feels kind of weird. It's like we're watching this big battle to save these people that had nothing to do with what was going on in the first 2 acts of the film. Whereas Two Towers, we're really getting to know the Kingdom of Rohan. There's a lot set up in the beginning with Theoden being under the control of Saruman, Éowyn and Éomer desperately trying to keep things going until Éomer gets banished, and Éowyn struggling with how she wants to defend her kingdom, even though she's a woman, so she's not given the same opportunities as the men to go out and fight. And so you really come to sympathize with these people, and you don't want to see them get killed in the Battle of Helm's Deep. And it's interesting, too, because the Jackson version of the Two Towers, I would say that one probably has the most dramatic changes from book to film. The long and short of it is they decided to cut out everything with Shelob and Cirith Ungol and save that for Return of the King. And they cut out everything with Gandalf, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli coming to Isengard, everything with Saruman and Pippin discovering the Palantir, and they moved all that to Return of the King too. The reason being because even though everything with Shelob happens in Two Towers, chronologically speaking, it was actually happening around the same time as the battle at Minas Tirith. So the filmmakers just decided to put them alongside each other. And I think that was a good choice. It made Return of the King a much stronger film. But it did also leave them with this huge gap of, okay, what are Frodo and Sam doing before they get to Shelob? And as to how well they handled that, well, we'll get to that in the next section. So for starters, it goes without saying that Andy Serkis as Gollum is phenomenal and one of the best parts of the movie. Very well done. It's hard to believe that Gollum is CGI. He looks so real, and considering the film was released in 2002, the fact that it still holds up to this day is just fantastic. Also, the way he's portrayed in the movie is very well done. You really sense the conflict within him between Smeagol and Gollum, and how he's kind of devolved into 2 personalities, and his struggles with wanting the ring back, his precious, versus his love for Frodo that he's come to develop. And the whole tension between him and Sam and Frodo, it's all really good. The animated film has this to a much more reduced degree. It's basically them traveling with Gollum, and then it ends with him thinking, oh, like, maybe I can trick them into going near Shelob and she can eat them and take the ring for me, which also happens in the live action film, but not until after they've gone through a whole lot together. I also think that the live action film does a better job of showing Frodo's compassion for Gollum than the animated film. Bakshki's Frodo seems to tolerate Gollum more than actually care about him. I mean, compare the 2 different versions of Frodo claiming that he pities Gollum.
Now that I see him, I do pity him.
Yes.
Maybe he does deserve to die. But now that I see him, I do pity him.
It's to the point where I almost wonder why Gollum's so full of conflict and claiming that Frodo is nice to him. Like, when? By comparison, the Jackson film includes a pivotal scene that wasn't in the books, where Frodo addresses Gollum by his real name, Smeagol, and we see the positive effect that it has on him. Frodo is trying so hard to save him, and it makes it all the more heartbreaking when he fails because of the pull of the ring and a misunderstanding involving Faramir. Which, oh boy, Faramir. Faramir, my buddy, my guy, oh, they really did him a number. So, to go into it briefly, Faramir is Boromir's brother, and they love each other, they get along great. Their father expresses clear favoritism for Boromir and is constantly leaving poor Faramir out in the cold. And in the film, this is played up more. The brothers still love each other very much, but Faramir is just desperately yearning for some kind of validation from Denethor, and really, who wouldn't in his position? So when Frodo and Sam fall into his lap, he's thinking to himself, oh, I can accomplish what my father really wanted and expected Boromir to do. I can give him the Ring of Power, and he will come to love and respect me. And also in the process, he's hoping that the ring will be able to save Gondor. And he ignores Frodo and Sam warning him that that's a terrible idea and it's not going to go well for him, until finally by the third act of the movie, he's come to realize, like, oh man, like, the ring wraiths almost took this thing, like, and Sam lays it out for him, like, Boromir, your brother, who you love and admire, tried to take the ring from Frodo. Like, he turned into a completely different person around this thing. It is dangerous. It corrupts people. You do not want this thing in Gondor. So he finally listens and he lets them go. In the book, there's actually a very similar conversation to the one that they have in the movie, where he's like, oh, so this is the answer to all the riddles, like, here you are, and the Ring of Power is within my grasp, and it's looking pretty tense, and then he just kind of relaxes and goes, like, it's fine. I know what this thing is and what it can do. You don't have to worry about me. I don't want this thing. And he laments what happened to Boromir, and that's kind of it. He's shown to be a character of great strength in a different way from Boromir, in that he is, or as he puts it at one point, like, he doesn't love the sword or battles or anything like that, just what they defend. Like, the movie doesn't get into that until Return of the King, which is kind of frustrating. And supposedly the reason why Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens decided to do this was partly because they had cut out Shelob and they needed to give Frodo, Sam, and Gollum an obstacle to overcome. So they took what was present in the books, the tension between Faramir and his father, and they said, okay, what if the ring tempted him with this? Which makes sense. And they also were thinking, like, they're trying to build up just how dangerous the ring is and its seductive power and everything, and they felt like Faramir refusing the ring would kind of undermine that. I'm not entirely sure I agree with that, because, I mean, you have the hobbits resisting it for the majority of the trilogy. There are characters in Middle-earth that can resist its power a little bit. I mean, even in the movie itself, they showed Gandalf saying, no, I'm not taking this. Don't give this to me. Don't tempt me. And Frodo holds out the ring and says, would you destroy it? And Aragorn gives it back to him. So it's not like they haven't done this before. They could have done it again with Faramir. I guess they thought it was one time too many. I don't know. But it doesn't bother me to the same extent as, say, the character assassinations in the Dracula movies. I don't necessarily like it, but I understand why you did it. At least in the movie, you understand his motivations and you understand why he's doing the things that he's doing, even if you don't like it. And he does have a change of heart towards the end. Acts much more in line with his book counterpart by the time Return of the King sets in. Now, as for the animated film, Faramir doesn't show up in the animated film, and I think that was a good choice. Again, he's a whole new character being introduced in Act 3. Presumably, if a part 2 to The Lord of the Rings had been made, that would have allowed for more smoother character development for him. Like, they could have fleshed him out more. Introducing him that late into the film would have just complicated things. Oh, Treebeard. Poor Treebeard. He gets one scene in the animated film, and that's it. And he is never heard from again. In the Jackson film, you gotta give him credit for making 2 chapters worth of plot stretch out for an almost 3-hour movie, 3.5 hours in the extended edition. In the book, The Two Towers, Merry and Pippin escape from the Uruk-hai and run into Fangorn Forest, and they encounter Treebeard, who is an Ent. They attend to the trees in the forest. So Merry and Pippin's role in the story is to let Treebeard know what's going on outside. They tell him about their journey, and they tell him about what's been going on with the orcs and the Uruk-hai and Saruman burning down Fangorn, which Treebeard has a huge problem with. And as he's listening to them, he's getting more and more riled up, and the War of the Ring, the matters with the ring bearer and stuff, doesn't really concern him, so to speak, but Saruman as his neighbor, that he's got an issue with, and he decides to summon the other Ents for a meeting called the Entmoot and decide what they're going to do about this. And they come to the conclusion that we've had enough. We're storming Isengard. Let's go. In the film, they talk about it, and they come to the conclusion that the War of the Ring really isn't their concern, and they don't have the power to combat the forces of Sauron, so they're not going to do anything about it. And it's implied that they don't really know what's been going on with Saruman. They know that there are a lot of orcs around, but they don't know what he's been doing. They don't know about his betrayal. So Pippin comes up with the idea when Treebeard's saying he's going to take them back as far as he can to the borders of the forest so they can go back to the Shire. He convinces Treebeard to leave them at the border close to Isengard so that when he gets there, he realizes, oh, Saruman has been up to some stuff, and he has been destroying the trees, and Treebeard is furious, calls all the other Ents, and they go storming off to Isengard. So from a narrative point of view, I think the film works better because it gives Merry and Pippin a much more active role in the plot. Like, Merry argues with Treebeard that the Ents are a part of the world. They need to help and take part in this fight. And Pippin comes up with this brilliant scheme to get them to realize what exactly is going on. In the book, they have about as much influence as your local news app. I'm sorry, but it's true. Like, they just say, here's what's going on. They're like, oh, we should do something about that. On the other hand, it's not necessarily perfect what the film does, because at least in the book, it makes sense why all the other Ents are present and ready to take Isengard apart. In the movie, the Ents decided they weren't going to take part in the war, so presumably they all went home. And yet, when Treebeard sees the destruction that Saruman's brought, he's able to summon them within, like, the span of a minute. And they all start marching to Isengard. It's like, where did you guys all come from? Okay. All right. But, it's a cool scene, so. Now, the book version that leads to the Battle of Helm's Deep and everything going on with Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and the characters in Rohan follows some similar story beats, but the way things go down is actually pretty different from Jackson's film to the book version. The animated version is actually more in line with what happens in the book. So in the book, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli meet up with Gandalf. Oh my gosh, Gandalf, you're alive! Yay! And then Gandalf's like, we gotta go to Rohan. So they go to Rohan, and they find King Theoden there, and he is basically in the throes of despair. He's been listening to his advisor, Grima Wormtongue, and he has pretty much given up and doesn't see any hope for Rohan, and he hasn't really been doing anything to combat Saruman's forces. Éomer, his nephew, has been doing a lot of the heavy lifting in that area, and he is currently in prison for giving Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli horses and not bringing them back to Edoras to be questioned by the king. Gandalf basically comes and knocks some sense into him and helps him to regain some of his physical and mental strength, mostly mental strength. He begins to hope again and decides that he is going to ride out in battle to meet Saruman's forces. He releases Éomer from prison. He and his armies get ready to go out to war. As they're out and about, Gandalf advises them all of a sudden to make for Helm's Deep instead, their fortress in the mountains, and he's got his own errand to run. They make it to Helm's Deep before the 10,000 Uruk-hai can show up, and they're basically holding down the fort until Gandalf can bring reinforcements. There are no women and children with them. There's no Éowyn. Éowyn is back at Edoras, ruling in Theoden's stead. Éomer is with them at Helm's Deep, and the rest of it kind of plays out the way it did in the movie, where Gandalf shows up at the last minute to save the day, only he's with someone named Erkenbrand that was commanding Rohan's forces elsewhere. And Erkenbrand's kind of like Glorfindel, where he's an important character, but he's a very minor character. So in the Jackson film, Theoden is actually under an enchantment by Saruman, and basically being possessed by him. Wormtongue's kind of keeping it going, and he's got like his own set of goons that are enforcing things. He doesn't imprison Éomer, he banishes him and the Riders of Rohan. So they show up again at the 11th hour to save the day. And I think that works better in the movie than in the book, because we've kind of gotten to know Éomer, so him showing up at the end to save his king and his people is this really cool moment. Like, yay, Gandalf found him. Yay, they're going to save everybody. It's awesome. And whereas if they had stuck to the book and brought in a character who we've never met before, it wouldn't have the same emotional impact. Also, so Gandalf, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli come to Edoras, and Gandalf basically uses his magic to free Theoden from Saruman's possession. And I have mixed feelings about that. I think the idea that Theoden is simply struggling with despair and basically depression and feeling like all is lost, I think that is better than just, oh no, he got possessed. Like, it's a little deeper, and I think even more relatable to real world events and how it can be so hard to fight off that sense of we're all doomed kind of thing. In the movie, he still has a character arc though. I actually kind of like how after Gandalf and company have driven out Wormtongue, they start advising Theoden on what to do next. And you see his eyes kind of travel to where Gandalf's like putting his hand on his elbow and saying like, here's what you should be doing. Like, and he's kind of, you can see he's kind of getting his back up against the wall, because it's like, I just got rid of one evil advisor. Like, I don't want to get sucked into someone else's advice and possibly have it go bad. There's also some underlying tension between him and Aragorn, because it's kind of like, dude, I'm the king here, not you. But Aragorn's clearly doing a lot of heavy lifting in defending Rohan. So he makes the decision to flee to Helm's Deep and empties out everyone in Edoras, and they're going to the fortress to save themselves from annihilation. Gandalf's like, no, that's a stupid idea. You guys are walking right into a trap, and you have no way to get out of that fortress if it falls, and you're going to get wiped off the map, which very nearly almost happens. You get the sense that Théoden's doing this not even so much to fleece Saruman, but because he just wants to make his own decisions, and he genuinely thinks this is the right thing to do. Another change is that some elves from Lothlorien show up, which is pretty cool. Unfortunately, most of them die, which is not cool. But it's meant to be this nice shot in the arm that the people of Rohan aren't alone, and they've got friends that are willing to fight for them. Also, by having Éowyn be present, starts her character arc of desperately wanting to fight in the battles, desperately wanting to do more, and being told, no, you have to look after the women and children, and her frustration with that. So that's well done. And having all these women and children at Helm's Deep, it provides this emotional weight to the battle, and an extra emotional weight. Because they're so heavily outnumbered against the Uruk-hai, Théoden pulls in some old men and young boys to fight in the army. And there's these really emotional scenes of these people getting geared up for war, and so many of them are just kids that have never been in a battle before, and they're scared, but they're soldiering up anyway because what else can they do? They're so outnumbered, and throughout the battle, when they're desperately trying to keep the Uruk-hai at bay, it keeps cutting back to the women and children in the caves. So Jackson is not letting you forget just what's at stake here and what's going to happen to all these people if the fortress gets taken. All these innocents are just going to get killed. So it's very effective filmmaking, and it makes the battle just that much more intense that there's so much more to lose. The animated version sticks more closely to the film, but as I mentioned earlier, because we're just getting introduced to the characters in Rohan, poor Éowyn doesn't get any dialogue whatsoever. She's just there, and then they leave. It doesn't carry the same weight. The only characters you really care about at Helm's Deep are Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, which, granted, in Jackson's film, they're the three that I was focused on the most throughout the whole battle, wanting to make sure they were okay. But in Jackson's film, you also care about what they're defending and why. In the animated version, it's more you just care about them. That's where the animated film really could have benefited from being a separate movie. And unfortunately, Ralph Bakshi didn't get the same time and resources that Peter Jackson did to flesh that out. But what he does manage to accomplish is very well done. So while Peter Jackson's film isn't perfect, I think it's a wonderful adaptation of the book The Two Towers, and it's still my favorite film in the trilogy by far. Helm's Deep, Gollum, Treebeard, The Ents, it's all wonderful. Howard Shore's score is magnificent. The special effects still hold up today. It's just, it's a fantastic movie. Ralph Bakshi's film, had he been given the same opportunities that Peter Jackson had, he could have created an absolutely incredible masterpiece trilogy of animated films. And I would love to see it happen someday. I think The Lord of the Rings does lend itself well to traditional animation. I would love to see someone do that with the same level of passion and sincerity as Ralph Bakshi and Peter Jackson lent to their films. But it's a good movie, good book. If you haven't seen any of them yet, I highly recommend them. Thank you so much for watching this video, and Ms. Sarah and I will see you next month for more frustrated book purist fun. Don't know what we're doing yet, but stay tuned.